Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to review this sword right here from Hanbon Forge. This is a review sample that was sent to me for the purposes of review, so you know that I didn't spend any money and I got it for free. If you think that makes me biased, you know right at the start. Other things that you should keep in mind as you hear my musings and ramblings in this video is that I am a novice practitioner of Japanese swordsmanship. I do study, I've done it for a number of years, but that doesn't make me an expert or an authority figure on the subject. I'm a collector and enthusiast, and you should keep that kind of context in mind as I share my thoughts and ramblings. The other bit that you should note is that this is, I believe, representative of what you'd expect to get from Hanbon Forge. It was sent to me brand new, but with handmade objects, there's some variation. Yours might be a little heavier, a little lighter, a little different in some way. Also, it might depend on what bedazzlements you put on. I believe they offer some customization services, so if you want something different, it may not exactly match the measurements and stuff that I'm putting in the description down below, which is where all that stuff will be. Anyway, plan for this video is to give you my thoughts as a practitioner, cover the build quality, dynamics, just general stuff, and then go into usage. Usage will start with stuff that you should do with the sword, and then move on pretty quickly, because I'm short on time, to abusive stuff, where I'm going to chop wood and eventually the croquet stake of doom, which caused failure on the sword. It is now broken, and I can share my thoughts and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully this video gives you some idea on if this sword is worth your $200 or not. That's the price point that I'm keeping in mind as I'm doing this review. Is it worth the $200? And I'll answer that question, me personally, if I think it's worth $200 towards the end of the video. But is it worth your money? Hopefully the video is sufficient. If you mute me and don't listen to my thoughts, to look it over and see if it is or isn't worth it, and you can make up your own mind on that kind of stuff. I don't know if that figure incidentally includes shipping or any other charges like that, so bear that in mind, that there may be some costs in terms of shipping. I can't remember exactly, but details and whatnot will be in the description down below. They market it as $200, and that's the kind of frame of mind that I'm forming this review in. Alright, sword friends, in my reviews I start with the kashra, kind of move soup to nuts, top to bottom, and that's what I'm going to do here. So this kashra, the pommel, the end cap, this bit right here, I happen to really like the fitting set. I think it's very nice, but part of that is because I believe it is a copy of a fitting set from Yamato Budogu, or maybe a copy of a copy. I'm not exactly sure how that all works, or who has permission to do it. I'm going to assume that they do, but I guess I don't really know for sure. Anyway, that's why I like it. I like the shape. It's marginally smaller than the set from Yamato, and it's not as well cast. It looks like a copy, and you lose some of the detail along the way in doing that. So it's not as good, but at the same time, it has the same kind of general shape and general aesthetic to it, which I happen to really like. It's plain and doesn't have kind of the same bedazzlements or boldness around the sakura leaves, the cherry blossoms that are on this kashra and on the fuchi. But I like the placement. I like how they look. It's sat on there pretty good, and it's important to note that as you're seeing kind of the ska right now, it's after all of the abusive testing, and it stayed on there, which is good. I've used this sword for a bit now. I've used it for a couple months, and I go out in my backyard and I practice EI and I try to get better at it. I'm not necessarily achieving that goal, but that's not the point of this video. What I will say is that it's been comfortable and it didn't come off, and so the kashra coming off after a few months of use wouldn't certainly be expected, but it's not surprising that they pop off after the abusive usage that I've done to it, and that didn't happen in this case. So I like it. It has loosened a little bit. I can kind of wiggle it around now, but all in all, I would say that it held on pretty good. Transition-wise, the knot down here is a little bit bunchy, and I can feel a slight ledge, but overall, I would say the transition here is quite good. From a practitioner standpoint, it was not something that caught my hand or caused me any discomfort. Anyway, I like the look, I like the shape, and I like how it was put on here, and it seemed to hold up well. I'm going to move on to the rest of the shape of the ska, the overall shape right here, and it's a comfortable shape. You can see that it has some wasting, not necessarily a lot. There's also a bit of dust stuck on here, so I'll remove that. I like the shape. It's been a comfortable shape to hold. It's not too big, it's not too small, and I think it's overall a comfortable shape. It doesn't have a lot of dimension to it. Again, you can see that it's a little thicker up top. It has some slight wasting to it, but nothing terribly special, and I'm not expecting it to be terribly special given the price point. What I was hoping it would do would be hold up, and for the most part, I would say it did that. The knots on here are, or rather the iaito is reasonably tight. It didn't loosen to any significant measure over the course of testing. The diamonds are, slightly misshapen and a little bit small in some cases. Iaito moves not necessarily freely, but more loosely over the minuki. All of those are pretty common for swords of this type. But the important bit is that the knots didn't loosen. The iaito didn't come undone. Nothing was uncomfortable. And overall, I thought that this was actually a very comfortable handle to use while I was practicing. And I'll show you some of the practicing a little bit later when I talk about dynamics. But the handle held up well. It didn't show stains or any of that kind of stuff very easily. If I talk about the other bits, there are samigawa panels underneath here. Forgive the dust. That didn't come on the sword. That's just leftover residue from the dirtiness of my home, which my home isn't actually that dirty. I don't know where that dust came from. But nevertheless, the samigawa nodules on here are rather small. These are panels, which I can kind of make out. If I take the fuchi off, I can see that there are panels on here, and I can make out quite clearly where the seams are. I don't see hishigami or little kind of squares or triangles. Not squares, they would be little triangles under here. So I don't believe that's the case. These are likely just the seams of the panel. It's unsightly, but again, something common in a sword around this price point. I think they could improve things by making a little channel for the samigawa to rest in, and that would probably reduce the rather unsightly seam that you can kind of make out along the edge here. But important notes is I don't see any kind of bits on the side. Making out the wood panels is a bit of a no-no, or making out the wood underneath is a bit of a no-no. I don't see that, so I do see the seam on the panels, and I see misshapen diamonds and you know, stuff that can move a little bit under pressure. But all in all, in terms of overall comfort, in terms of expectations, I would say it certainly meets those expectations for, again, something in this price. Now bear in mind that you can have a handle rewrap, but to have it done by somebody really competent that does hishigami and tsukamaki really well can cost more than the entirety of this sword. So when I say that it's, you know, appropriate for a sword in this price point, $200 isn't going to buy an expert that's doing this kind of stuff. So again, having a handle rewrapped, it wouldn't surprise me if it cost more than $200 to have done, and then it's fair to expect a high level of execution. Here, I'm expecting it to hold up to the testing, which it did, to be reasonably comfortable and reasonably tight, and hopefully not be something that's going to fall apart after a few months or ideally several years of usage. And I don't know how long it's going to hold up in terms of several years, but over the course of months where I've used it, and I used it not necessarily daily, but several times a week, it has held up and not caused any issue. That's not necessarily a triumph of any kind. It just means that it didn't fall apart in that time, so at least it has that going for it. The Minuki on here are reasonably well cast. They show up in brass, and that's the only brass that I really see apart from the shitadome, which originally came on the side. Those are the little washer pieces that go in the kurigata, where the sageo, the thing that holds the sageo on the scabbard. We have black lacquered samigawa panels over brown. This iaito, incidentally, feels somewhat cheap. It feels like cheap synthetic kind of silk, but I didn't notice any discomfort or problematic issues with the handle at all. So you can kind of feel that it's not really high quality silk, but it doesn't really impact usage. And again, it held up pretty well. Other bits to note: the mikugi on here were just simple kind of bamboo pegs. They weren't colored at all. You could take a Sharpie to them if it bothered you to see those things. They came out very hard. In fact, all of them broke trying to get the handle off. The handle, when I took it off the sword, actually came off very easily and very well. Not easily in the sense that it would cause you any danger, but it didn't require a lot of percussive maintenance to get the handle off, especially after I used it. But the Minuki did not come out, and those required basically destroying the Minuki to get them out of the sword. So that is one thing that I would say is not ideal, but also, again, not terribly unexpected. And replacement Minuki or Mikugi, I should say, the little pegs are not expensive and can be done. If it bothers you, like making them out of some sort of resin or something like that, there's tutorials online on how to do that if you want a new one. But I wouldn't call that necessarily a deal breaker myself, but I'm putting it in here because it is an important factor. If you try to take the Mikugi out, I had to break them to get them out. Okay, I'm going to move on to the fuchi right here, and there is a ledge on this bit. No discomfort was caused, but this was right up next to the Tsuba, and the Tsuba was a bit of a cheese grater on my hand. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I didn't feel the ledge when using this. I felt the Tsuba more than anything else. And I think that normally I might feel this ledge a little bit. In this case, I did not, but I think, again, it's more because there was a cheese grater above it than anything else. Overall, though, it fits reasonably well. It's not too catching. There's no sharp ledges or anything like that on here, and I don't know that it would necessarily cause you a problem. And aesthetically, it matches the kashra, which I mentioned I like quite a bit. If I take this off, I would note that the ska did crack in the process of using it. I believe it was in the process of using it. It could have been cracked out of the gate. I didn't look until I broke the sword and took it apart. But there's a crack in the ska. and I believe it's likely from usage. I didn't notice any rattling though, so when I was using the sword and hitting it into things and eventually breaking it, I didn't notice any rattling or issues inside the handle. And so overall, I think they did a pretty good job on the handle. This is, something that I would expect the kashra to come off, the ito to maybe come undone or loosened significantly, and to see a lot more cracks than I do here, as well as rattling of the nakago when I use the sword as it's broken. And I didn't notice any of those things. So overall, I think good job on the handle. I'm going to move on to the Tsuba. So I really like the aesthetics of the Tsuba. I think that this is an excellent Tsuba. It's an emulation of a Tsukashi style Tsuba. It's not terribly thick, though that isn't necessarily important. And I like this little ring bit here. Aesthetically, I think it's actually fantastic, and I hope they continue making fittings like this. This one could have been smoothed out a little bit. It's quite sharp on my fingers, and maybe that's how the originals are, but as a practitioner, it did grind on my hand if I choked up on the Tsuba a little bit. It's got some not sharp intentionally ledges, but enough of an edge on there to kind of wear your skin down a little bit. That said, I think it's well made. It held up well. It didn't deform or diminish, and I banged on it quite a bit. So overall, I think that this is a great Tsuba, and I think it's a closer emulation to what it's trying to simulate in this Kashi Tsuba. Given that it's a mass-produced water jet cutout kind of thing, I look at other similar Tsuba to swords that I've gotten, and I compared this to a Tsuba that I got on Musashi Tsuba. Also, it's trying to emulate a Tsukashi Tsuba with some engraving and things like that on it, but the details tend to look muddy, and it's got this kind of gold emulation on it, which I think cheapens it a little bit. It's granted my personal take on aesthetics, but I think that this is closer and more elegant than this. Alternatively, here's a crane Tsuba, again emulating Tsukashi. This also has sharp ledges and stuff, but you can see just kind of how fine these little details are on here. This also has sharp ledges and causes some discomfort, but this one I think is overall a better presentation. The blackening on it looks better. I think it doesn't look as cheap, and yeah, I just happen to I think the Tsuba is really quite nice. I like the execution on here. Not my favorite theme or anything like that. I'm not partial to this, but I like the elegant little lines, and this is, I think, one of my favorite parts of the overall sword was this Tsuba right here. Okay, I'm going to move on to the Habaki right here. So this Habaki is now dead, but I have some photos of it before it was dead. And I like the brass Habaki. I generally tend to like Habaki that aren't the simple brass. And even though this is copper, and even though it's the same shape, I like that it's at least a different color. And it was matched with these copper seppa right here, which overall, everything, I think, aesthetically looked good, and it was on there reasonably well. The Tsuba, I should note, did have a little bit of wiggle that developed over time, but not so much that it caused me any concern, and I'd imagine that it could be tightened down a little bit, but I should also note that under the Habaki, I kind of moved on from the Tsuba, but it wiggled around a little bit. If I finish up my thoughts on the Habaki here, it did basically break. And this is not common, not something that I see in Habaki very much. And so it's got this copper Habaki. I like it, but maybe it's a softer metal than brass. I'm not exactly sure, but it did almost like tear apart in the course of using the sword. And that's not something that generally tends to happen. So bear in mind that if you get a copper Habaki, this one seems to be somewhat fragile in comparison to the brass one. They usually deform and there's wiggle that appears, but they don't generally tear like this. Now that might also be because I don't see a little ledge. A lot of times the hamanchi, which is this part right here on the sword, rests on this little kind of ledge inside the Habaki, and that doesn't appear to be there, so maybe it flexed in such a way that the sword just kind of cut through or pushed through the Habaki. If I talk about the hamanchi, moonmanchi on the blade, which I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but they don't appear as off. These appear pretty on level, and a lot of times they're off center a little bit. Here's more dust for your viewing pleasure, but they tend to be a little off. I like that these are made on an even plane, and it overall is handsome. And the Habaki ripped, and that's something that I've seen on an antique, and I'm not calling that a deal breaker either. It's a little bit of a surprise that the Habaki tore, but it's something that I've seen on antiques. It's not something that I would like to see happen, granted, but also with the things that I'm doing with it, it's not terribly surprising that that kind of stuff happened. With a bit of a hammer and maybe a little solder, this maybe could be remedied. I've never tried to fix one myself. Anyway, a little bit off-putting, but not necessarily terribly concerning. All right, I'm going to move on to the saya now. So the saya is a simple red colored saya, it had some issues with it. One, the shirodome never seemed to be glued in from these swords in China, and this was no exception. I like the size of the hole and everything in here, but the shirodome bounce around as soon as you untie the knot, and I just remove them. Otherwise, they tend to bounce around and scratch up the saya and just irritate me. I also noticed some blemishes from the sageo being tied on in a presentation knot prior to the lacquer being dry, so there's some smudges and things in here. Again, things that I see commonly, but if this was allowed to cure a little bit longer, I don't think that would have happened. They might buff out if you use like Mother's Mag or something like that. They're not like terribly deep impressions or anything, but it's unsightly and disappointing when you see that kind of stuff after you untie the presentation knot, which you're going to do if you're going to use the sword for any kind of practice or something like that. Not that you have to. You can leave it obviously tied, but if you're going to use it for Japanese swordsmanship and put it in your obi and do iai and things like that with it, then you would untie the knot and you would find this somewhat unfortunate surprise. Other than that, it's a simple tube. It doesn't have any real depth or dimension. It's got horn parts on either end, and they're reasonably well put on. The saya held on reasonably well. It didn't rattle a lot when it was all together, and it was actually pretty quiet and overall a comfortable saya to use. Here's the koiguchi, reasonably well. Let's see if I can get it to focus. Probably not. But the koiguchi is reasonably well made. I found it to be quiet. It held well. It didn't rattle. The habaki was tensioned correctly. It didn't come out if you turned it upside down and gave it a little gentle shake, and it was easy to remove the habaki. Overall, from a practitioner standpoint, it was actually a comfortable tool to use. Just some, unfortunate stuff that the shirodome weren't glued in, and that that there's little, impressions on here. Other than that, the saya was a good tool for usage. I'm going to move on to the blade, and I'm actually going to start with the Nakago here. This is actually a pretty decent Nakago, all things considered. Now, again, we have fun little dust particles. I don't know where all the dust is coming from, but it doesn't have a whole lot of finish work on it. But again, this is a relatively inexpensive sword, and a good, clean Nakago shows me that the manufacturer's putting detail and time into things that most people aren't ever going to see. A lot of people never take the handle off for cleaning, and so when you put energy and intention into making this nice, then it gives me the impression that you're probably putting in intention into other things that I can't see, like the heat treatment and the geometry and other things that maybe people don't pay a huge amount of attention to. So this, for the money, granted, in terms of being an excellent example of a Nakago, it is not, but for the money, I think it is actually quite good. It has clean lines. It has some taper that runs down the planes of it. The carvings and the mei on it are on there and actually reasonably well carved for what I see. It looks like they're pretty deep impressions and not done with some sort of little quick engraving tool. The shape is a little off. It doesn't have a lot of file markings on it, but it's not dirty or ugly or really poorly put together. The Makugi Ana, the spot where the little pegs go through, had burrs on it, and I think that left some residue and stuff inside the handle, but that's, again, very common. I bet this blade was finished before it was mounted, and then the holes were drilled when it was finally put in the handle, and those burrs were left on. But otherwise, the presentation on it is quite nice. And again, I like that the hamachi moonmanchi are on an even plane and not kind of off-center, which tends to happen on these swords. Other bits to note about the sword, the blade itself. I liked the shape when it was originally together. It has kind of a light and lively, reasonably comfortable, not necessarily a thick, terribly robust sword. It felt lively, comfortable in the hand. It was really fun to use for iai, and that's what I did most of the time with this sword. I swung it around quite a bit. I practiced my forms and whatnot with it, and it was actually a really comfortable tool for the money. I thought it was lively, comfortable. If you want to practice with a shinken, there was nothing really problematic about the sword overall. It was easy to draw, it sheathed correctly, it was comfortable. Again, the Tsuba developed a little bit of rattle, but that wasn't necessarily problematic and happens to most of the swords if you use them for any length of time. It also went through some temperature changes and whatnot, going in a cold environment and out into a warm environment. Other bits to note about the sword, I can't remember exactly what steel this is made out of, but it's a mono steel, as in one homogeneous type of steel, and I don't believe it's folded, and it also had kind of a mirror polish on it, so there's not really any details to show you in terms of polish. It also looks like it went under some sort of buffer or something like that, because all of the lines along the shinogi are all kind of soft, I guess I would say. You can make them out, and the polish was smooth and clean, and there were no ripples, and the lines all flowed actually pretty well. It was a reasonably well-shaped sword, but at the same time, just the shinogi's somewhat soft, and that happens if it's buffed under kind of one plane. Moving on to the Kasaki up here, there wasn't There was an attempt to put in a yakote. It's not geometric or anything like that. I don't believe it has to be, but there was an attempt to basically sand a different direction to give the appearance of a yakote in a shinogi zakuri kind of kasaki area. Overall, it was fine. It did the job, but again, there's no etching or any kind of metal activity to look at in the steel. It was very much a tool and lacked any kind of detail upon very close inspection on the surface of the steel. There wasn't really much to see there. The other bit I should note is that it wasn't terribly sharp. So talking about the blade, I'll put, again, measurements and specifications and all that kind of stuff in the description down below so you can see measurement-wise what this one was. Comfortable to use, not terribly beefy though, so more of a lighter sword. The other bit I suppose to note is that it didn't come terribly sharp. So if I move on to the usage side of things, again, I noted that I practiced with it. I did that kind of stuff with. When I went to cutting, I went to do a pool noodle, and it just really didn't bite into the pool noodle the way I would expect this sword to bite into it. So I did do a bit of sharpening with it, and I don't have any footage of that sharpening for you, but the sharpening consisted of basically taking a 1000 grit belt on a 1x30 sander, which is what I use, kind of holding it freehand and basically just kind of giving the edge what it needed to just hone it up a little bit. Then I took a leather belt with jeweler's rouge on it and kind of basically, I guess, buffed the edge, deburred it, and that gave me the edge that I was looking for. And when I went to test a pool noodle again, it just bit right in and sent some of the pool noodle stuff sailing, and it was a much more comfortable sword to use and kind of had the edge that I would have expected it to. When I moved on to the next target, which was tatami mats, it actually cut tatami reasonably well. My poor form is, I'm really trying to get clean angles, and I'm not getting them here. I'm kind of rushing through it for the purposes of the review and my short kind of timetables, but it held up really well and actually cut through tatami really well. I didn't have to swing for the fences. The sword did the work once I had the edge put on it. Even though it's a little lighter, it still was effective for tatami. I wouldn't call it a competition cutter, but it did the job. So, I mean, if you're trying to look for a sword to primarily practice EI with, and that should also cut tatami, or if you happen to prefer a blade that's a little bit more lively than something that's a little more purpose-built to be a competition-style cutter, this was a comfortable experience. From there, I moved on to do some water bottle cutting. I went into water bottles. The water bottles cut on the sidewall as you'd expect a sword that's razor sharp to do. The important bit to note is that I cut down through a neck. I've had several swords be damaged by the neck of water bottles. That plastic area around the neck and the cap is much harder. I went straight down rather than kind of a glancing cut, which makes it maybe not fair to compare it to other videos that I've done. But the important bit is I cut straight down through the neck of a bottle, and the edge wasn't diminished in any way that I could discern. There was no deflection or any kind of issue that I could find with the edge after cutting through water bottles or any of the other targets that I had done post-sharpening. And I put a very fine edge on it, so if it was going to be damaged, it would hopefully be pretty easy to see. Anyway, from there, I went on to branches. Now, a neighbor of mine cut down a cottonwood tree, and I have some access to green branches from the cottonwood tree. It's not a particularly hard wood, and the branches are green, but it makes for a great target, and I cut a bunch of those branches at varying thicknesses, and at no point did the sword take any discernible damage. I tried to bend it by hitting it on the side. I stabbed the tip into it and twisted, and I cut a lot of branches near the mana-uchi of the blade at varying degrees and varying angles and various levels of success. Sometimes it sailed right through, which was pretty cool, and at other times it did not and got stuck in the blade and would bind, and at no point did it take a bend or a set, and at no point could I see any deflection in the edge. I would say, though, at the end of cutting these branches and things like that, or towards the end, it lost the razor edge, and I couldn't shave my arm anymore. Now, I could shave my arm with the part of the blade that I'm not cutting with but sharpened, and so that's my comparison. But towards the tip of the blade where I really focused on getting it actually the sharpest, I lost that really razor edge. It was still sharp enough that it would cut, but not sharp enough that it would do kind of razor activities or pop any hair off my arm. So I did lose some sharpness there, but no deflection, no bending, nothing like that. The sword held up really, really well for those activities. So that's when I took it to the croquet stake of doom. Now, it's important to know that this is, I'm expecting it to break here, and how many licks it takes to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop is kind of the question, but I'm expecting it to take damage. I'm expecting it to break. There hasn't been a sword yet that I've smacked into the croquet stake of doom and that has not taken damage on the first kind of quasi-gentle swing. And so this one was no exception. It took a big bit of edge damage right at the end, but still something that I wouldn't say would buff out, but that you could sharpen and continue using. I did several strikes on the edge, and at no point did it really go in more than 1 millimeter or maybe 1.5 millimeters in terms of edge deflection and damage into the edge of the blade. I did several more strikes. Obviously, more damage occurred. I'm hitting at various degrees of hardness, but at no point am I really giving it everything I have. One, because it's very dangerous and I don't want it to fly back at me, so I'm trying to do it as controlled as I can. But it didn't really take any giant edge damage. No big chunks broke out. None of that kind of stuff. When I damaged the edge somewhat, I brought I brought it back to some branches and stuff, just so you can kind of see it didn't cut through the branches the same way with the damaged edge. It would bite into them. It would still cut. It would still be quite lethal if that was a person, but not. It wouldn't cut through the branches the same way it did. When I tried cutting lower on the edge, it would sail through the branches again with that razor edge. So after cutting a couple branches, just in contrast to see, what that kind of edge damage does, I brought it back to the metal pole and I hit it a few more times and eventually it broke. Now the important note here is that I didn't have to flip it around on the spine to break it. And any sword would, potentially break on the croquet stick of doom. But very often I do enough edge damage, there's no exact count of strikes that I'm trying to go for, but I have to flip it around to hit it on the spine to really expose those weaknesses and make it come apart, and I didn't have to do that here. So to me, I think this actually broke a little prematurely, and in looking at the cross-section of the blade, the grain doesn't look as fine as it could, and there are some minor dark spots around it. I don't know if I can interpret those as fractures or cracks or problems with the steel. Obviously, it took a lot of punishment. It cut branches and tatami and did all the things that I was supposed to do, and it wasn't until several strikes in that it broke. But I would still call it a little bit premature for a katana that's as thick and substantial as this is. Even though it's a lighter on the scale of katana, most of the time I strike the edge, and when it doesn't show any damage like this, it's pretty rare for it to break. So I didn't have to flip it around. I didn't have to hit it on the spine, and it eventually broke just by hitting it into the croquet stake of doom. So to me, I think it could be a little bit more durable. There might be something that could be done in terms of tempering to make it more resilient. But did it hold up and do sword-like things the way swords should? I would still say yes. Well, it didn't hold up as well as some of the other counterparts that I've tested. Some of those other counterparts may have been thicker, more robust. They may have been thinner, actually. It's tough to say exactly. But I think there's some improvement that could be done on the heat treatment side of things to make it more durable. Does it need to be? I mean, not really. Honestly, it cut through all the things, and you saw what I did on some of those branches. You saw some of the bad cuts, and it wasn't until I really took it to a steel rod and started that it really deformed and basically broke. So I think that it's pretty sufficient to do any kind of dojo related activities. It's sufficient to do beyond dojo related activities, but I would still say that it's not as durable and robust as some other swords in the price category that I've tested. I recall a Ryan sword and a Ronin Dojo or the Ronin RK series swords. All of those seem to hold up a little bit better, to at least in terms of withstanding and still being in one piece, the aggressive testing that I've done on them. So this broke a little sooner, but at the same time, it's still a decent product. All right, I'm going to try and consolidate my rambles here and answer the question, do I think the sword is worth the money or not? At $200, I would say yes, it gets a recommendation, but it's not really the best at any particular thing. What I would say is that it excels at being a comfortable tool to use for kata if you're looking for a budget shinken and are somewhat handy. The Tsuba developed a little bit of a rattle, and it's a bit of a cheese grater. It's exfoliating Tsuba. It doesn't necessarily poke you like some really badly designed Tsubas, and it's not fragile or breakable, but it does exfoliate you. It removes a layer of epidermis that you don't want, or maybe reminds you that you shouldn't choke up on the Tsuba that much. Anyway, there's that, but other than that, it was tensioned right, it was quiet, it was comfortable to use, it's light and lively, and overall I thought it was a very positive experience to use for kata if you're looking for a budget shinken, and overall I thought that's where it excelled the most. In terms of cutting, well, it didn't come sharp enough to really bite into pool noodles out of the box, and other swords have, and so I don't think a sword personally should need to be sharpened out of the box. Other people would agree with, some might agree, but I think a lot of people disagree and say that you should know how to sharpen a sword. I think it should come ready to go out of the box. Others have. This one required a little bit of honing. Not that much. It was almost there, but required a little bit of honing before it would really zip through pool noodles or really be effective at some of the other types of tasks that you would want to do for cutting. So that's a bit of a deterrent, but at the same time, once I put an edge on it, the edge held up well. It didn't bend, and overall, it did a lot of the abusive stuff that I wouldn't necessarily expect it to do. I expected it to diminish edgewise in cutting the neck of the bottle a little bit. It didn't. I expected it to get duller or bend a little bit in cutting some of the branches and stuff like that, particularly on bad cuts, and it didn't. Where it failed, I would say, is on the croquet stake of doom, which again I know is something that is going to break the sword. I thought it broke prematurely there, and so if you're looking for something with ultimate durability, I don't know that a sword that's light and lively like this would be my recommendation. Something along the lines of a Dojo Pro, which is obviously more expensive, but those offerings from Ronin tend to be more robust and thicker swords, heavier, harder, more cumbersome to use, I guess I would say, but they also offer a kind of a resilience to cutting that other swords that are smaller like this don't tend to. I would also say that heat treatment could be improved and it could be more resilient than this one is, but at the same time it held up to a lot of the tests and held an edge and did all the things quite well. So it's not dangerous or bad or anything like that, but I think there is some improvement that could be made in terms of making the sword more resilient to some of these very aggressive types of testing. But it held up through the vast majority of them. So I wouldn't say any of that is a deal breaker, but you can make your own mind up about that. To me, I thought it was a fun tool mostly to use for EI. Once I sharpened it, it was a fun tool to cut water bottles and stuff like that with, but it wasn't as resilient to some of the other swords that I've used in the even less expensive category. Both the Ryan sword that was around 130, 150 bucks, and the Ronin RK series, which is granted a different sword altogether. It's made of 1045 and it's differentially hardened and it's got, it's a different thing altogether. But either one of them did a better job of staying in one piece for longer with the types of aggressive testing that I do. It's worth noting though that my testing process has changed a little bit. Neither of those swords, I don't think, face the croquet stake of doom, which is proven quite a bit more efficient at breaking swords than my previous methods were. So anyway, that's all the stuff I have. I think it was a good sword for 200 bucks, but hopefully the video helps you make up your own mind. So that's all I've got. Special thanks to Hanbon Forge for sending me the review sample. It was fun to test out and use. If you're interested in getting one, again, links and all that kind of stuff will be in the description down below. And that's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.